Hello, welcome. I want to read to you a portrait of Herman Charles Bosman written by Bernard Sachs. And of all the people who knew Bosman, one of the most faithful accounts we have of what Bosman was like comes from his close friend Bernard Sachs, who he was actually at school with, where they were of a similar age, and they knew each other from a young age until Bosman died in 1951. And Bernard Sachs, actually in his own right, is a very good writer. He is, by the way, the uncle of L.B. Sachs, who's famous in South Africa as a struggle hero. And this comes from a book that was released in 1959, and it's called South African Personalities and Places. It's a fantastic work that really does cover a bunch of interesting figures of that time, including Jan Smuts, Sarah Gertrude Millen, and Bernard Sachs' own brother, Solly Sachs, who was an interesting character in his own right. It's called Herman Charles Bosman, Under the Lash of Fate. And Sachs writes, with the death of Herman Charles Bosman in 1951, a South African writer of genuine stature passed from the scene. I first met Bosman about 30 years ago at Jeppe High School. I was standing next to him in line during a cadet parade when a hefty cadet officer approached him and told him not to stand like a backvelder. An altercation followed. The cadet officer shot his fist at Bosman, and a pair of poetic eyes peered out of a face covered with blood, eyes that looked into regions beyond. Well, I wasn't too much of a cadet myself, and a close friendship grew up between Bosman and me. I learned quite a deal about his complex makeup over the years of our association. Bosman just couldn't fit into a uniform or into a straight line, and his course through life was on that account jagged and hard. From the first moment that he opened his eyes on this world, he was destined to be a tragic figure. Right through his checkered life's course, Bosman kept some kind of balance with the aid of that humour redolent of the mad king and the fool in Lear. That humour which is the last concentrated word of the human being under the lash of fate. Now, when Bosman was rushed to Edenvale Hospital, that's in Johannesburg, with what turned out to be a fatal coronary thrombosis, the doctor asked him where he was born. And he replied, born in Kuils River, Cape, died in Edenvale Hospital. In actual fact, although he did die soon after that, he actually died when he returned back to his home. Now, Sachs continues, you couldn't tell by the smile playing on his face that death was clutching at his throat. And you couldn't tell by the joviality of his manner during all his 46 years, well, only 46 years, that life was clutching at his throat. As a schoolboy, Bosman already possessed literary qualities of a high order. His school essays were informed with that elegance and whimsicality characteristic of his mature years. It is significant that he was hopeless at mathematics. Things earthy and finite were beyond the compass of this man, constantly preoccupied with the infinite. I was sitting close to Bosman during the geometry test of the matriculation examination. He read the test paper nervously and proceeded to write an essay to the examiner, telling him, in flawless English to be sure, why he should overlook his ignorance of geometry and pass him because of his literary talent. Geometry, the measurement of the earth. What had Bosman, with his elfin, fanciful mind, to do with it? I would give a lot to recover that essay he wrote to the examiner. Edgar Allan Poe was the greatest influence on Bosman spiritually. It was with the utmost reverence that Bosman would pronounce his name. I have a letter from Bosman in my possession in which he wrote, when I was at Jeppe High School, they opened a new school library. This was my first serious introduction to literature. Thousands of wonderful new books, that smell of newness coming from them when you open the pages. And in a ponderous tome entitled Masters of Literature, I saw, on a page next to some poems, a daguerreotype portrait of a man whose face I liked. I read the caption, Edgar Allan Poe. That was the first time I heard of Poe. But I sensed, even then, that the moment of that encountering was an immortal moment." Unquote. Now, our nocturnal wanderings often took us to the edge of Johannesburg and to the edge of human speculation through the mist of the years. And I can still remember him saying to me one night, "Edgar Allan Poe was the poet of the letters GH, ghost, ghastly, ghoulish. All except ghetto," I added, which fell within the purview of Heine. But Bosman replied, "Poe jumped out of the ghetto wall, out of the world." Flight was the dominant theme in Bosman's life. Flight from society, flight from the world, flight from reality. And this fanciful romantic who that night also spoke about the need to reach out beyond the cold infinities of space, beyond the palace of the brain standing confined within the steel bars of thought, to a vaulted grace of the divinest emptiness. This romantic was, through a series of unfortunate circumstances, fated to be thrust for a long number of years behind prison bars of real cold steel into the very nadir and apotheosis of realism. In his work Cold Stone Jug, Bosman wrote with excruciating poignance of the impact of prison on his life. And he wrote, "This is really a love story, a story of adolescent love, my first love. Her eyes were heavily fringed with dark lashes like barred windows. Her bosom was hard and pure and cold like a cement floor. It was a faithful and chaste love. During all those years of my young manhood, in whose arms did I sleep each night, but in hers." Speaking of his prison experiences, Bosman once said to me that he felt a queer sort of intimacy with some other men who have been in prison: Villon, Verlaine, Oscar Wilde, O. Henry, and St. Paul. My own feeling is that St. Paul would have been out of place in this colourful company. He was too much of a realist. Well, despite the strong streak of the divine in him, he was of the earth and mankind, in the way Bosman was not. Bosman stood outside of society. His dislike of society, the social processes and the human beings, was unqualified and complete. It is not easy for me to pen these words, but any delineation of Bosman would be meaningless without stating these hard facts. It was inevitable that the world battered Bosman, and he hit back. There were occasions when he struck back savagely. That's not to say that Bosman was without humanity. He just couldn't direct it into social channels. But he showered his love and affection on those who, like himself, were battered and maimed by life. One of Bosman's most brilliant essays was a slashing attack on Osbert Sitwell because he'd written contemptuously of dwarfs. Now, it is futile to speculate whether Bosman would have been a greater or lesser artist if he had accommodated himself more readily to social routine and convention. The question whether the artist should go into society and help to remove its crudities, or fly away to the ivory tower to weave artistic patterns in space, is one that has been debated since time immemorial. With Villon, Verlaine and Rimbaud, Bosman could well be called a decadent, in that he stood outside of the interests of society, its hopes and its fears. But the way things are going these days, the decadents can well argue that society itself is not too hot. I mentioned this in their extenuation. This is not the place to estimate the value of Bosman's literary work, but I feel that I must tender a few general impressions. Bosman was a highly cultured man, far more so than most South African writers. And his horizons were also wider and more sweeping. Unlike the majority of our writers, he did not borrow from the bookshelves of Europe, but had assimilated the essentials of European culture. He knew English literature thoroughly, and he also had a first-class knowledge of French literature. A few days before he died, he recited to me in French the whole of Poe's short story, The Cask of Amontillado. Although the setting of his short stories were on the edge of the Kalahari and his characters were indigenous hard-bitten Boers, these stories have a universal application and are the product of a mind universal in its comprehension. Those who can see in Bosman's stories only the Boers of the Mariko have missed their essential quality. Technique and imagination are perfectly harmonized in these stories. Bosman's finest literary achievement was his collection of short stories, Mafeking Road, a slender volume but exquisite. I would place it on a very good level of European or American writing. It stands, in my view, above John Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat, which deals with the comparable setting of uprooted Mexican paisano's, languishing on the edge of a desert. The essential quality of Bosman's short stories is their humanity. Now, Bosman did not like human beings, but he loved humanity in the abstract, a schizophrenic phenomenon common to artists, including Beethoven, it is said. That humanity which Bosman possessed and which he could not direct into society flowed with marvelous profusion into his short stories. The dacha-smoking natives, Roiniks, seducers, and plain crooks all glow with warmth as they are touched by his humanity. And his humanity also carried him well over the racial chasm. I believe his finest short story to be Unto Dust. In it, a native and a Boer fall in battle and are left to rot in the field side by side, exposed to the sun and the rain and the wild beasts. When 6 months afterwards the Boers return to the scene to bury the remains of their dead comrade, they experience great difficulty in sorting out the bones, who's who, between the white and the black man. Another story, Mariko's Scandal, conveys to us the searing tragedy of colour in South Africa, does so more effectively than volumes of political declamation. Bosman also essayed a novel with his Jacaranda in the Night, but it was not successful. The novel was not his meteor. That realism, which is an important ingredient of the modern novel, clashed with his whole spiritual makeup. Bosman was, more than anything else, a poet and a dreamer, a perpetual child. His stories were actually prose poems, etched in wisp-like lines in which he barely touched the earth. It is my belief that he should have devoted himself to poetry, which was his essential talent. He's actually left behind in random places a substantial body of poetry. Only the other day I came across a bundle of his poetry in my drawer. I don't know how it came there, and I'm quite sure Bosman knew nothing about it either. Now, when war broke out in 1939, Bosman returned to South Africa from England. He told me that he had left behind a file of poetry in a house in Hammersmith. We wrote to a friend in London asking him to recover it, and we received a reply saying that the place had been bombed out. On the Friday before Bosman died, he had a housewarming party at his place out on the veld near Edenvale. It was a very lively party, and at one point Bosman said, "It's so jolly that I feel this house will never be cold again." When in the early hours of the morning we proceeded to make our way home, we found that our cars were bogged down in the mud. The rain was coming down in torrents. We went back to the house and were entertained to a recital of excerpts from Shakespeare, by Bosman, of course. But one of the revellers insisted on making his way home to Auckland Park across the veld. As he walked into the night, Bosman said that it would be the correct thing for him to declaim from the stormy scene in King Lear. Well, the day after, Bosman too walked out into the night. May it be a still, tranquil night.